Hello, everyone, and welcome to my first recording in 2021. It's been a while, but what an exciting speaker we have for today. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Willem Standaert from HEC Liege in Belgium. I have had the privilege of working with Professor Standaert when we were colleagues together at a business school in Belgium. But he's an expert on meetings. And much before we had COVID and the pandemic and the virtual meetings, he was already talking about meetings in the past. So he recently has a publication which is going to be appearing in Business Horizons, which does talk about meetings and what's going to happen and what's been happening during COVID, and also his vision about what it means after COVID as well. So Professor Standaert, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and my audience.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
So Willem, tell me about your research in general. Let's not talk about COVID now. Let's talk about in general, what is it that you work on?
Sure. So I think I should start with my own PhD research, which started in 2009. And this was under the supervision of Steve Meule and Amit Basu. So for 6 years, I worked on virtual meetings. So until 2015. So back then it was still something you could say rather niche, or at least, it was used a lot, but only, let's say, by global organizations. And in my research, I collaborated with Cisco Systems, so the huge internet player. And so, they gave me kind of access to their people to do interviews, first of all, but then to also conduct some studies. And actually how we got into the research is because they had a technology called Telepresence. So Telepresence is technology where you have an immersive experience. You see other participants in real life size. It's like a whole room that is equipped with like big screens, etc. There's spatial audio. There's the lighting is adjusted across the rooms. The same furniture. The desk seems to continue. So the question was, if you have such technology, why would you still travel for a face-to-face meeting? So that was the starting point. So we looked, to address that question, we took the broader notion of what are the different technologies you can use in a virtual meeting. So of course that includes audio conferencing and video conferencing, like in Zoom, what we are having right now, in fact. So the idea was to compare, to understand when and how does it make a difference, what you use in your meeting. What we basically focused on is what you are trying to achieve in a meeting, right? So what is your objective? So because that, the literature said, should steer how you decide how to meet, right? And it was, an interesting couple of studies that we did, where we did find that there are significant differences across these modes or modalities, as we call them. And so for sure, people should be cognizant of this and base their decision based on that, rather than just doing it out of habit, or out of what is available, or taking cost into consideration, of course, as well. They should really look at what is the most effective way to meet.
And let me sort of interrupt you there, Willem. So essentially you talked about different modalities. So essentially what you're saying is the options that a company has for a meeting. You can either do it face-to-face, that is one modality, and then one would be over the phone. The other would be through normal video conferences, which was still in early stages, and you would always have bandwidth issues and stuff like that. And then, of course, telepresence would be the highest level. Am I right in understanding these would be the different modalities available for companies?
Yes. And this is important because they differ significantly in their capabilities. Basically, audio conferencing or telephone, you only have audio. So video, you add an element of visual cues, but it's relatively limited in size and quality. Telepresence would then be full-fledged. So you see the capabilities building up towards face-to-face, which is like, okay, this is the gold standard. This is the best way to meet. But at the same time, you increase your costs, right? The cost of using audio, video, telepresence. Face-to-face, it depends, because people might be co-located anyways in the office. So then the cost is quite low. But if your meeting requires travel, the cost becomes very high. And that's when this decision, of course, becomes more important, because now you can save a lot of costs and time and all the other things that you get through virtual meetings, which is like flexibility and even environmental benefits that you can get.
So tell me about, so essentially you're talking about a kind when this was just a luxury to have, right? Essentially, this was when you were doing this research, it was not becoming a necessity. Maybe it was in terms of cost, but it was not something where, this was a pressing matter. And I'm specifically coming from a sales situation where the belief in many business to business meetings would still be that a lot of things gets done when you do face to face. So from that angle, tell us a little bit more about how have things evolved. So essentially you said 2009 was when you started, so which means that you have had quite some time to think about this, observe this, talk to experts on this as well. And since the time you graduated in 2015, have you seen an evolution as well, even in what is becoming accepted as ways? Because at the end of the day, is that the success of anything depends upon not just you wanting to set up a meeting, but on the other side, the other parties should also be comfortable with that as well, right? So tell me a little bit more about how that has evolved in terms of your company, external to your company, the acceptance of these kind of meetings.
Yeah. So that's where it becomes more complex, right? So I must say that a lot of the research I focused on was indeed internal meetings, where you can have the assumption that everyone has the same access to the same set of technologies, the choice set. Now, indeed, it becomes more difficult. There's more coordination required if you involve external parties. But I would also say the set of objectives also becomes, differs. So just, I didn't really specify before, but we have built these different categories of objectives, which include like a category routine, exchanging information, right? The other one would be making decisions, communicating sentiments, and then building relationships. Now, I think what you're saying is if you are having meetings with external people, the latter, building relationships, becomes really prominent typically. I mean, the other ones are also relevant, but the way I just listed them is actually an increase in the capabilities that you need. Indicating that indeed for the latter, for building relationships, it is more important to use meeting modes with more capabilities. And so, that should drive the decision. And therefore it is, perfectly explainable that a lot of sales meetings, etc., that people travel for them because you need those. Now, one of the things that our research showed is that telepresence is at the same level for all these objectives. So if you have telepresence, but telepresence, again, comes at quite a cost. It actually, if you invest in it, it costs you multiple hundreds of thousands of euros for one room. Of course, you would need multiple. You can also, some hotels and even airports actually invested in this such that you can rent it. So you can have it for book it for an hour or a couple of hours. And in that way, you either, instead of using the hotel for travel, you actually use it to meet other people. So that's one option that you have. One of the other things that I think is important, an important insight, is that I extended my research beyond Cisco. So I also went to a large European bank, as well as a really engineering-driven company. And what came out of that is that there are differences across these companies. So the culture around meetings, around virtual meetings, also is different. And this is also an important factor to take into account, of course, when you are deciding how to meet, because you're not sure that people have the same, even symbolic meanings attached to the use of a certain meeting mode. What I mean with symbolic is that, in some situations, people might say, oh, they just call this an audio conferencing meeting, so it's not going to be important, right? Where in others, it might be that they do audio conferencing meetings all the time, and so they do it as business as usual. And so these kind of small things are also important to take into account if you have external parties to the meeting.
But this is very interesting, right? Because at the end of the day, while your research initially was focusing a lot more on meetings in general, it did not have to be sales. It could be that your salespeople are talking as well. But I want to really pick your brains on two things. One is the date, which exactly, I believe, 11/3 or 3/11, depending upon which part of the world you're in. 11th March apparently was the day that the World Health Organization declared coronavirus as a pandemic. So it's exactly a year to the date. And it's so appropriate that I'm talking to an expert on this as well. So which meant that even till that point in time, your customers, especially when we talk about sales, had the choice, right? They could say, I still want to see you face-to-face, salesperson. I mean, the customer could decide whether they want to see you face-to-face or they want to see you in different formats as well. So tell me, how has customer behavior changed since Kurunai, I'm asking you from your expertise and what you observe right now, because I think if your customer is not ready for it, your salespeople or your organization, no matter what you do, you have to go by what the customer wants, right?
Yeah, I guess you're getting to a point where it's also about, who's in the driving seat, right? Is the customer asking for something, or is the sales organization more from a commercial standpoint reaching out, let's say? Now, I think, the pandemic is, of course, a very particular situation, but it was the somewhat same situation for everyone. Now, that should be nuanced as well. But what I mean is that basically everyone was working from home, which came with its own complexities. And everyone, you could say like the adoption of virtual meetings became 100%, right? So some statistics say that before the pandemic, it was at 40%. Of course, during it was close to or at 100%. And actually, there's a permanent shift expected, close to 75% is what Gartner is saying. Anyway, so as I said, the adoption or the use was at 100%. So it was clear that you had no other option, which means that you as a sales organization, you needed to go with this, whether or not you would have preferred to go face to face. And I think what's important to indicate here is that there is this notion of, if you travel for a meeting, you do some more effort, right? And so somehow maybe the customer appreciates that effort that you do for them. So that might help them, choose for you rather than a competitor. There's this, like Bill Gates, he says that business travel will reduce dramatically, or 50%, again, permanently. But then again, this CEO of an airline, he said, as soon as you see a competitor win the customer's business because he went there face to face, that's when you will stop doing these virtual meetings altogether.
Very interesting.
And go back and meet them face to face. Now, I think another notion is quite important is that people started doing virtual meetings, and so virtual meetings by default, whenever and wherever. So, and that is not necessarily a good thing, I think, because you could almost like not decline a meeting. I mean, before you had this, you could say like, it doesn't work out, I cannot come at, whatever, I need this to do this before or after, so it doesn't work out. Now, virtual, you can go back to back in these virtual meetings, which is first of all exhausting. And second of all, you might be accepting meetings where, you're doing other stuff on the same time, or you know that you're going to be distracted because your kids are at home and these kind of things. So in that sense, I think the pandemic also, brought up some bad things about virtual meetings. I mean, people might now think that these things are associated with virtual meetings, but I think it's important that they distinguish this from, let's say, a pandemic situation, which we are in, and a setting in which we use virtual meetings as an option, which again is what we will have post-pandemic.
And that is very, very interesting that you talk about this, right? So, because as you said, people always say, salespeople, especially were working remotely always before, but the pandemic, it's not the same, right? Working from home during a pandemic is not the same. As you said, you have kids at home, you have bandwidth issues. You are stuck at home where you don't have the possibility of taking a break from your settings all the time and maybe visit a customer. I even heard, I saw a report on CNN. They talk about the fake commute. That is people actually driving to their workplace, sitting in the car in the parking lot, and then going back and making this virtual kind of shift, so that you go back and say that, okay, that's the time people usually would have when they come back. So if given all this,
that's a good point. And people need to kind of, relax from their work, and commuting was an important element of that. One thing I am also now just thinking of is that I think what is missing for salespeople is that they do not get to travel to the customer. So there's certain cues that they cannot pick up on, right? So the subtle things about the company culture. How do people even dress there, or what is important? What are the values presented at the reception or what have you? Like, do they celebrate their employees? All these kind of things. So you kind of miss out on it. At the same time, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, because people have their privacy issues, but you get to see a little bit of the customer's personal side more, because and some people might not like that, because of course, I don't want to mix too much of my personal private stuff with my work stuff. But again, we didn't really have the option. Of course, you can use like virtual backgrounds, which goes some way into hiding your context. But yeah, other things might be going on in your home with your, again, kids, dogs, whatever. So for salespeople, it's an opportunity, I would say, but you're not sure how your customer feels about if they pick up and use these things, if they people actually like that and appreciate that, I think.
Let me ask you one more question before I want to pick your brains on what are the best practices about virtual meetings that you would suggest as well. Right? So one of the things that we're talking about is the fact that as a salesperson in the past, now I'm not necessarily expected to travel. Either my company says no, be safe, or the customer's organization says no, you cannot visit, let's say. And again, this is going to eventually change once you have more vaccinations and stuff like that. But things, as you said, are going to change no matter what. I think I really like your idea of the different stages of the relationship and saying that certain parts of the relationship, maybe the initial stage and the negotiation stage, you might have face-to-face, and then the others can go through, normally would have been a phone meeting, but actually goes through that as well. Now, tell me about this. One of the things I hear from a lot of salespeople is that just like the salesperson now has more time because they're not traveling, they're not stuck in traffic and stuff like that, the customer also is not traveling. The customer is also not with, and suddenly you have meetings where normally you would have just been one or two persons in a face-to-face meeting. Suddenly you have a Zoom or a Teams call, and suddenly you have 15 people in that call in the customer's organization. And how do you deal with the complexity that arises because of this? Because now everybody is on the call.
Yeah, you touch upon an important element, which is about the flexibility of virtual meetings, which enable including additional people very easily. Now, one thing I should already say is that yes, we see this in our data, that virtual meetings have more participants. And this is not necessarily, I mean, this is kind of a double-edged sword, because it's not necessarily better for the meeting outcomes. So let me clarify. So if you are using a meeting mode like virtual, and so with limited virtual video conferencing with limited capabilities, then and you add more people, actually the meeting generally becomes less effective. So actually what you need to do is add capabilities. What does it mean? Either go for telepresence or face-to-face, which is more costly. So there's always this tension, this trade-off. So yeah, I think it's in the sales context, it's very important, because now you might all of a sudden from your own side, from the customer side, have more senior people joining. Because also they of course are usually the ones too busy to join a meeting, but you're not sure that them being there in a meeting, if they're, for instance, not well prepared or whatever, is a good thing, because it might be messing up the whole process that you have had so far with your customer, or the other way around. So on the other hand, it can be a clear advantage, because this is typically where you use virtual to include this, subject matter expert. And so, so basically, you're in your meeting, and you can easily ping the person that you think of. You say, oh, this person will be able to help you immediately with that question. And so for that, in that sense, it's a big plus that you can do that. It's kind of playing into this flexibility. But what I think is important there is that we develop some, let's say, acceptance that it's not required for people to sit through the whole meeting. So what I'm trying to say is, I think we might have all experienced that we're in this meeting and we say, okay, my part of the agenda seems to have ended, but it's not like you can just leave. It's kind of impolite kind of to do, especially if you're in this customer supplier setting. And so we need to kind of, I think, change that, because I think the whole idea would be to have like a revolving door. People enter, people leave. And of course, there should be someone that has the control and overview, the orchestrator of everything. But apart from that, I think it should be perfectly normal for people to just walk out without excuses or anything. It's just, I mean, my part of the agenda is done, so I can leave, right? So that's what I think is important to change in terms of how people look at this.
Interesting. So if I were looking at asking you as an expert on these kind of meetings and stuff like that, so please tell me, or our audience as well, is what are the things that we should keep in mind? Because for virtual meetings right now, let's say, for example, Zoom or Teams, assuming that the customer, because when you talk about telepresence, it's just not your side, the customer also needs to have a telepresence room and stuff like that, right? So please tell us, essentially, if I'm a salesperson, what are the things that I should be doing? First of all, let's begin with preparing for a meeting. What should I be doing?
So I think people are expecting like a lot of new stuff when you ask them for tips. But I would say, first of all, what applied in face-to-face still applies largely, although people don't, largely do it, which is, indeed, set the agenda, set like, and make clear for the invitees, so who you invite, why they should be there. Not just say, you're invited, it shouldn't end there, but like set the agenda, set even a timing. I don't know how many meeting invites you get with a clear timing for each agenda point. It's in my experience, it's quite rare. But yeah, that's on the preparation side. Of course, sharing documents goes along with that, which again, the documents play a very important role. They can completely steer, I would say, the interaction that you will have in the meeting.
Yeah.
As long as the people have actually read that. So preparation is also, I think, about finding the suitable time to meet, right? And again, I don't have to tell you, but given virtual, you are easily including people in different time zones, etc. So it's a more important consideration as well. What else? Yeah, of course, the access to the technology. So not everyone has necessarily this. Of course, we have massive adoption of Zoom right now. Which is an interesting case in itself, but we don't need to go there. And then of course you need to check, does the other party, can they access actually this technology? I think this is one of my dreams, or an idea for a startup, is to be able to integrate Zoom with Microsoft Teams, with WebEx, what have you. So it's like, like you have your mobile provider, right? So each can have their own mobile provider, but you can all still call. It's not the case for video conferencing, and this would be a huge advantage in terms of coordination,
indeed,
time savings.
It's very interesting, because at the end of the day I can easily imagine that salespeople have to learn to live with the fact that depending upon what platform your customer asks you to be active in, you will try and do, even though you might have a preference. For example, we are in the academic space. I prefer Zoom, but hey, if my corporate client wants me to be on Teams, I will have to be flexible there as well. So it takes me out of my comfort zone, which can be pretty stressful for some salespeople, because suddenly you feel flustered if things are not going your way, if the technology you feel is against you and stuff like that as well. Huh?
Yeah. So that's indeed another important point related to this, is that there's always, depending on the person, of course, there's a learning curve with each platform and technology. And then typically in the beginning of the meeting, you even have a couple of minutes that you need to get for everyone to make sure everyone is well connected. There's typically audio, video issues. And so the meeting doesn't start very fluently typically. And so you need to handle that kind of, almost some of the frustration elements as well at the very beginning of a meeting, which is, again, not very nice. So to the extent that you can prevent this, I think the better, to have a smooth start of your meeting. So again, it's probably indeed going into checking with your customer what they prefer to use, such that at least the issues are not on their side, for instance. So yeah, these things is, I think, what you can do in your virtual meetings and preparing virtual meetings.
But that's for them. But what would you do during the meeting itself? So one of the things you said was setting the agenda, making sure you take a look at it. I'm assuming that one of the things you'll also do is that if it's with a platform that is not something you're familiar with, that I would actually familiarize myself with what kind of platform I might do, setting the agenda. That's great. I like the idea that you still have to do the same kind of preparation. But I really like this idea of also setting expectations, saying that, hey, there could be somebody from our team joining, but would you think it makes sense to also say that, hey, if there's going to be a meeting using multiple people, and if you know ahead when they're coming in, you could say this part of the agenda is relevant for you. So if there are people, does it make sense for me to be proactive and tell that as well? Because I can set the expectations if it's people from my side and say, hey, this person will jump in for the call and they'll leave. And similarly, at the end of the day, we could say this could be relevant for everyone. And we don't necessarily tell the other side that they have to stay or leave, but we can say this is relevant for the following profiles. Do you think that makes sense?
I would even go as far indeed as saying, if you have a big meeting planned, like maybe even more than 2 hours or something, then indeed you really want to say, some of us will be there all the time, but if this part, we will manage closely the time and we will not waste your time if you don't need to be there. So like this agenda point, we expect these people to be there. Next one, maybe some of the same, some others. so yeah, again, this revolving door idea, I think, is again what virtual meetings easily facilitate. By the way, I just mentioned long meetings, and this is one of the other caveats, is that you should be careful about having long virtual meetings. So again, first of all, there's the Zoom fatigue thing, right? Yeah. Which is that, it's more tiring to do virtual meetings rather than face-to-face meetings. And then, this is related to the fact that we also see a drop-off in effectiveness for longer meetings if you don't have sufficient capabilities for the objective. So that's to complete that line of thinking. So so during meeting, what else I think is quite important and is not done enough maybe is the dynamic use of capabilities. Yeah. So why I'm saying that is that typically also in a sales call or meeting, you will have a first part of the meeting where you really want to get to know everyone around the table, right? So so that's when for sure you would need or use video, have your videos on. Maybe there's a very one-way information part for which people might actually be turning off their video or be asked to turn off their video because somehow, these videos can also be a distraction. So if you want the people to focus on the content, maybe you can just say we can all turn off our video now. To not have that as and then turn it on again when it becomes relevant again to kind of share ideas or the more emotional stuff that you want to also bring to the meeting.
So you mentioned something which I think was going to be my last question, because in the interest of time as well, is effectiveness. So how do you know if a meeting was effective? I'm putting you on the spot, but I want two answers. One is, in the short term, how do you know it's been effective? Mm-hmm. And in the long term, are there indications of what makes an effective meeting?
Right. This is a difficult question. Well, I will just give, step by step, let's say, but the definition of effectiveness is the extent to which you achieve your objectives. Mm-hmm. Now, in one meeting, several participants may have different objectives. Everyone may be coming to the virtual table with another set of objectives. So it's a very kind of, personal thing, which makes it easier to say, I think, immediately afterwards, after the meeting, is like, did I get out of that meeting what I want to get out? Mm-hmm. Actually, it requires you to think before the meeting, what is my objective? Exactly. Which I don't think everyone does. The organizer of the meeting typically does. And that's the one that sets, the agenda, and chooses the meeting mode, right? So they have most control of it. You could say they have most control of achieving their objectives. Now, the other participants, they just need to go with what was determined for them. And as I said, I think they should think beforehand, what do I want to get out of this meeting? Yeah. Maybe if what I want to get out of this meeting and the meeting mode is not suitable, maybe I should just raise that point and say, I think we should meet face-to-face, or I think we should, use something else. So that's what you can do. And so I think after the meeting, you can kind of say for yourself, at least, did I get out of this what I wanted? I think you can also look at it at an organizational level, or maybe from a sales organization, of course. I think it's the same as, measuring ROI of a lot of your other let's say marketing and sales activities. The outcome is typically maybe a couple of weeks, months later. And so in the end, of course, you can only say this was all worth the effort. So that's a long-term bit of a hard question, I think. Yeah, but it's a very interesting research question, though.
I think especially for sales, right? Because for other meetings which are internal, you could take a look at different kinds of surveying the people, whereas in sales, if you have, we should not, of course, take a look at COVID, because COVID is when you've been forced to deal with it. But if you try and take a look at how long it took for you to make a sale before, and are you making more sales now? And is there differences between the amount of time some salespeople use on meetings as against others, to see those how do they use it more effectively based on sales? And that's going to be very interesting by itself as well. So, Willem, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and our audience. This is fascinating research, and I know that you're not just looking at sales, but also overall. But I'm sure at all the meetings that you have, eventually there has to be a salesperson at some point of time in front of them, of all the people that are meeting out there. So I'm sure that the salespeople are there somewhere in that research that you're doing as well. So, but
yeah,
I think
sure.
what you did from 2009, I'm sure is going to become more relevant than ever, if not already now and moving forward as well. So good luck with your research. And I plan to look forward to what are the different things that you come up with as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.